Hello everyone. This is What If Luffy Was Raised by Whitebeard. Please like and subscribe and enjoy the video. Ace could hear Luffy's cries from where he was chained on the disgusting ship, and with each whimper Ace worked faster to get them off. He knew time was of the essence, but a small voice was taunting his mind with what ifs. What if he did get the chains off, then what? What if Luffy dies in that room, then what? What if Marco and the rest of the crew never find them, then freaking what? Ace knew these were questions that would need to be answered at some point, but chose at this point in time to just work faster. Ace's hands were shaking from the adrenaline, and it took all he had not to cry out when the knife slipped from his fingers, slicing down his hand. Taking a deep breath and trying to ignore the now stinging bloody hand, he bent his back down a bit and grabbed the knife once more, working the lock as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, the thunder had brought rain, and rain brought heavy waves that splashed him in the face as often as they could. His hand now mixed with blood, and the stinging of the ocean waves made holding the knife very difficult, but he would do this for Luffy, he would do this for himself. He fumbled around, twisting and turning the knife until finally he heard the one sound he had been dreaming of, the click of freedom. Dropping the knife to the ground, Ace felt the chains slacken, and he pulled them loosely away from himself. Marks had started to form where they had tightly bound his body to the mast, but he didn't care right at this moment. He now needed to think up a plan to get off of this damned ship before the storm fully came upon them and they were lost forever. He knew that Luffy had done his share of the thinking and was probably at his limit for thinking for the next year or so. It was his turn to take the lead and be useful for once. What the? One of the crew members said as Ace dropped the chains from around his body and grabbed the knife from the floor. Hey guys, wanna have some fun? Ace said, smiling, his eyes overshadowed with anger. The knife held firmly in his bloody hand, but not a hint of fear was in his body. Meanwhile, Luffy had been thrown to the floor the moment they brought him inside. Of course, he just bounced and stared blankly at them as they sneered at him. Should we tie him up? One of the men said, pointing at the kid on the floor. Only his hands, I'll be the one to show him what true fear is, the man said, smiling, while Luffy was tied to a post in the room, his back facing the man. You don't scare me. Luffy said, glaring at the man, who only laughed. Not yet, I don't. Luffy wasn't sure what was going to happen, but he would be brave and strong so Ace could escape. He didn't expect the pain to come suddenly or really at all, but when it did he couldn't stop himself from crying out. The man, now holding a whip in his hands, smiled proudly at the sounds the kid had made. I'm going to whip you, bloody kid, but don't worry, I won't kill you, you're going to make us some good cash after all. He said before bringing the whip up once more and flicking it back over Luffy, back breaking his rubbery skin. Luffy had never felt pain like this before ever in his life. The tears fell from his eyes in pools as the whip hit him over and over again. Ma, please, he whispered out, begging his best friend, his brother, his parent figure to come find him soon. No one's coming for you, kid, ever again. The laughter was the last thing Luffy heard before the black started to fill his vision. Line break. Marco was now angry at himself for taking so long to find this damn ship and the people on that ship for taking his brothers. Pound you, Yoi, was all he said, and if he could smile through his beak, he would be grinning like a maniac from the malice and evil thoughts going through his mind. The only thing that stopped him from landing on the deck right that moment was the thought that Pops would want to teach them just as much a lesson as he did. On his back, a snail had crawled out of his flaming feathers to talk to him. Anything? Thatch asked the snail, firmly gripped on his back. Pound them, you can track me through the transponder snail, right, Yoi? Marco asked and could swear he felt the smile Thatch had given through the phone. We've been following close behind you this entire time, please don't kill them all before we get there. Thatch asked nicely but got a laugh in return. I make no guarantees. He said before swooping back into a landing position and dropping his feet onto the railing. He looked around and saw Ace standing up to a bunch of men, a knife in his hand as he went around each of them, cutting them as he fought. Marco couldn't help the smile that came to his face, seeing his little brother stand up for himself, but the smile soon faded once he realized Luffy was nowhere to be seen. How come it takes 4 men to gang up on one child, Yoi? He said, making the entire ship freeze and Ace to turn around quickly. Marco, he whispered, feeling relief spread through his body as the man stepped onto the deck, now hockey radiating off of him. Marco. Luffy needs help, they took him inside. Ace screamed at the man, whose eyes darkened at the crew standing there. You have 10 minutes. He said in a deathly quiet voice. What? Ace asked quietly. You have 10 minutes to surrender, let the kids go, and we will probably let a few of you live. He said, catching everyone's attention. After those 10 minutes my old man will be here, and let me promise you that if my anger is enough to scare you, you really don't want to see his Yoi. Marco said, tilting his head to glare at them in a different light. Who said we're letting anyone go? A man said from a doorway, and Ace gritted his teeth. That's the man who took Luffy. He whispered harshly to Marco, who gave the man a blank expression. I said so, if you're smart enough you might actually want to do as I say, Yoi. he said, staring the man down, surprised that he hadn't fainted from the hockey he was giving off. Now you have 7 minutes, Yoi, he said, still staring at the man. You think we're scared of old man Whitebeard, he shouted at Marco, who only shrugged his shoulders. You might want to be. Ace said to the man, and Marco took notice of Ace's ankle. Why are you wearing that, Yoi? He pointed to the cuff, and Ace glared at the man in the doorway. That's to make sure the little fire starter doesn't burn down the ship, he said, and Ace felt a head hatch coming on. Fire starter? It's freaking raining, he said, annoyed again. Did you forget what we gave you, kid? Ace really hadn't been thinking of what he had eaten since he was busy being chained up and worried about Luffy. Eaten, Yoi? Marco felt dread in his heart. The devil fruit, Ace whispered, looking up at Marco, who didn't look away from the man. Your time is now 5. He lost all kindness in his voice as a large ship began to appear through the mist, the rain drizzling down, making Ace's black hair curl and stick to his face. You want the other kid? He asked Marco, who now refused to even talk to the man, anger burning his heart. The man snapped his fingers, and Luffy was bought out. Marco had to use all of his training not to snap the man's neck right there and then. Luffy was in bad shape, his face bloody, his shirt ripped and torn, and his back a mess of marks, tear stains on his cheeks mixed with blood and dirt, making the kid look rather pitiful. The stupid man threw Luffy to the ground with a thud beside him, laughing at Marco's expression. You want to leave? You're going to need the keys to that cuff, or that brat's never going to use his flames ever, he said, pulling a key from his jacket and throwing it in the air. Ace watched it fall, vanishing from sight. Did I ever mention to you, kid, that sea stone is the strongest in the world? You need the key to get them off, or they never will. Marco sighed, glaring at the man, a smile finally coming to his face. Time's up, a voice said behind them. Ace didn't have to turn around to know it was Thatch, and he himself couldn't help but smile. You didn't actually kill anyone? Thatch asked Marco in surprise, who held his smile. Now I can, Yoi. And he took a step forward to the man who held Luffy. I gave you time to surrender, I gave you a chance to give in, now you can go to hell, Yoi, he said. The man snarled at Marco. Kill them, men, he shouted, and the crew shouted out a cry. If you insist, Thatch said, rolling his eyes and pulling his katana out, stabbing one of the men through the chest. Marco raced to Luffy's side and picked him up. Ma, he whispered out, his eye swollen and bruised. I'm here, buddy. Ace, using his small knife, protected Thatch's back while the other commanders swarmed the deck. How dare you? A voice boomed out. The man who had thrown Luffy to the ground was pointing his sword at Pops, and the older man looked down on him. If I take your head on my ship, I'll be famous, he said, laughing manically. Marco pushed Luffy to a wall and threw his shirt over top of him to keep him warm from the mist and rain. I need you to stay here, Lou. I have to punish these men for hurting you and Ace, Yoi, he whispered softly to the boy before kissing his black locks. Be safe, Luffy whispered out before closing his eyes, having done enough fighting for the day. Always, Yoi. And he turned back towards the man who was staring up at Pops. Pops? He's mine, Marco said, and the old man gave him a questioning look as Marco walked slowly towards the man. Did you know that kid you beat around is my little brother? Did you know that he's been in my care since he was born? Did you know that I've raised him from an infant to a strong child? Did you know that I almost see him as my own son? I bet you didn't. I'm no mother, heck, I'm not even a father, but the moment you touched even a single part of his body, you had signed your own death warrant, Yoi. Marco kicked the man in the ribs and was satisfied to hear them break. Pops turned away from the fight, taking on others around him. Marco needed to do this more than he did. That's the guy that beat Sabo, Ace pointed out to a man who was firing his gun at the crew, and Pops knew exactly who he could take his anger out on. Marco punched the captain in the face but didn't let him fall as he gave the man an uppercut under the chin, blood spilling out of the man's mouth. I considered breaking your neck and ending it quick, but honestly I'm so angry I want you to feel it, Yoi. The man had too much blood in his mouth to even talk as Marco brought his leg up and kicked him across the head. It hurts, doesn't it? He said, looking down at the man. But I'm not finished with you yet. I want you to suffer. I want you to hurt like my little brother is right now, Yoi, he said, blue eyes flashing dangerously at the man who pulled his pistol out of his sash and fired it at Marco in blind panic. What a stupid move. I'm a phoenix, a bird born from flames and ashes. Even if I am knocked down, I shall rise again. You, on the other hand, shall never be given that chance, Yoi. And Marco kicked the man in the knee, making him drop to the deck. A scream of agony came from the man's mouth, but Marco wasn't listening as he kicked the man in the face, and he dropped down, not getting back up. Marco's anger was far from spent as he brought his foot up to attack once more, only to be stopped. Ma, that's enough. It was so soft, but it caught his ears. Luffy, he had almost forgotten his little brother in his anger. He brought his foot back down to the deck. Let's go home, he had Luffy whisper, his eyes still closed. The kid was shaking from the rain, and the shirt was now damp. The crew had taken out the rest of the men, the ship broken and dying. We have what we came here for, let us leave. Pops cried to his sons who cheered. Thatch was carrying Ace, who had given him a hug but would later deny that gesture if asked. Marco walked carefully over to Luffy, who was still shaking. "Shh Lu, I'm here yoi." He pulled the boy closer to him and felt the child cuddle into his arms, trying to take the warmth from his brother. "I want to go home," Luffy said softly, his voice cracking from holding in his tears. "I know, we're just about there," he said, picking him up carefully to not hurt him. Marco turned his back and started to walk back to the Moby Dick that was docked right close to the rival's ship when suddenly a cry could be heard. I won't let you take my merchandise," the captain that Marco had beaten said, standing up, pointing his pistol towards Marco's back when a gun was fired and the man dropped to the deck dead. "Sorry, he was pissing me off," Aizu said, brushing a stray piece of hair out of his beautiful face. Marco smiled at the man. "No problem, let's go home yoi." Aizu smiled at them in return before jumping onto the Moby Dick with everyone else. As soon as everyone was back on the ship, the sails were unraveled and the large ship sailed off. "Is everyone alright?" Pops asked his sons as he was brought inside by the nurses, who were very upset by the amount the older man had pushed himself. "I need to get these guys to the infirmary, they have a brother waiting for them," Thatch said, holding Ace in his arms. "What about my leg?" Ace asked, now worried, remembering what the man said about sea stone cuffs. "We'll figure something out yoi," Marco said, but Luffy pulled on him to get his attention. "Ma, I found this," he said, opening his tiny hand to a small key. Luffy had picked it up when he was brought out of the room. That's the key to my cuff," Ace said in excitement as Marco took the key from Luffy, kissing his forehead in a thank you. Unlocking the cuff from around his ankle, Ace could feel the warmth fill his body in a way he never thought it could. "You alright there, bud? You feel kinda hot, did you catch a cold from the rain?" Thatch asked, placing his hand worriedly on his forehead, but Ace shook his head, smiling. "I feel complete," he said, and Thatch raised a brow in confusion before Ace's shoulder caught fire. "What the F?" Thatch said, almost dropping the kid as Marco put his hand over the flame. "That guy called you a fire starter, now I see why yoi," he said, looking at Ace closely. "I'll look into what fruit you ate and we can go from there. You'll need proper training on controlling it once we know what you've become," Haruta said, looking Ace over. "Let them rest for now, get those boys down to the doctor, let her take care of them, they've been through enough tonight." Luffy was sleeping softly in Marco's arms. Ace looked over to the boy and smiled. "Luffy fought bravely," he said quietly, making the surrounding people smile. "You all did tonight," Vista said, but Ace shook his head. "He was strong like Marco and brave like Pops. When things got bad he stepped up, he sacrificed himself for me." Ace choked, everything fully coming down on him of what had happened and what was done. "Rest, my son, you're both safe here and never again will someone harm you," Pop said, brushing his fingers over Ace's mess of curls and waves. Ace rested his head on Thatch's shoulder and nodded, giving silent thanks. They were home, they were safe, but the storm had not yet fully passed over them, only the rain had fallen, lightning had yet to strike. Luffy had learned something recently, something that changed his entire life forever: he hated chores. He was told by Marco that now that he was old enough to go out with his brothers on an unknown island and return home with cuts and bruises, then he should be old enough to mop the deck. Marco had taught him, Ace and Sabo, the ways of the cleaning, but Luffy was not interested in any way. This must be a new form of punishment for not listening to him, that must be it. He went to Pops and complained about it rather seriously, but Pops just told him to listen to his brother. Ace and Sabo grumbled about doing them, but they didn't seem to be put out about the idea. Luffy wasn't going to give in just like that. "What are you doing yoi?" Marco asked, his arms crossed and brow twitching in annoyance. "Nothing," Luffy replied, lying on his back on the figurehead looking at the clouds pass by. "Shouldn't you be helping Ace and Sabo?" He was getting frustrated with Luffy and this was a new feeling for him. "Helping them do what? Are they working on a new prank?" Luffy sat up and looked excitedly towards Marco. "No, they are finishing their chores, which you should be working on as well yoi." Marco looked at Luffy sternly. "Oh, that's all? No thanks." And he lied back down to look at the clouds once more. A tick appeared on Marco's head. When had Luffy become this stubborn? "If you don't help out you don't get dessert tonight yoi." This caught the straw-hatted kid's attention. "You can't do that. You're not a chef." He pounded his fist against the deck in defiance. "Watch me, brat," Marco challenged and walked away. When dinner came around, Marco and Luffy weren't talking to one another. The silence that went between them really threw off the crew. Luffy, you alright there, buddy?" Thatch asked, feeling the chill in the room. "Yup," was all he got in response. Thatch was getting worried. "Did you and Luffy have a fight?" Haruta asked Marco, who was eating his dinner quietly. "Don't know what you're talking about yoi," he said, not looking up but continuing on. The rest of the crew was watching them, worried, but figured they might be fine later. "Well, who wants dessert?" Thatch asked, hoping that would warm up the room. "Luffy doesn't yoi," Marco said matter-of-factly, glaring at the kid. Luffy looked up quickly, sending a glare right back at Marco, as well as one of his carrots from his plate. The carrot hit Marco square in the face, making a tick appear back on his head once more. "Who says I don't?" Luffy asked him, raising his eyebrow in question, daring Marco to challenge him. Ace and Sabo were stunned into silence. What the hell was even happening? "I say so, brat Yoi." Marco stood up, using his height against the child. Luffy stood up as well and glared back at him. "Boys, that's enough." Whitebeard boomed at them, surprised on the behavior. "Fine." They both said and left the galley, going separate ways, annoyed at one another. "What the heck just happened?" Vista asked from his spot at the dinner table. "I think Marco and Luffy just had their first fight," Thatch whispered. "This had never happened before." "You mean they haven't fought ever?" "Not even once?" Ace asked in surprise. Even him and Sabo had fought before. Thatch shook his head, no, having a bad feeling about all of this. They've always been close. Marco practically raised Luffy from birth. If anything, they've had small arguments but never a full-out fight. No one knew just what to do in this situation. The next day appeared to be worse than the one before it. Luffy was given a broom by Marco, only to watch the kid put it up against a wall and run off to do something else. Fuming, Marco chased after him, only to lose him in the crowd of his many siblings. He found Luffy later on that day coloring in a room. "Hey Marco, lunch ready?" Luffy said with a smirk towards the angry blonde. "You ditched your chores again, Yoi," he said, ignoring the food question and the smirk. "I'm not doing them," he said simply, then looked back up at Marco. "Want to color with me?" he said, smiling. "No, I don't want to color, Yoi. I want you to do as you're told." He was on his last nerve. "Why do I have to?" Luffy asked, annoying Marco, his face beginning to turn red. "Because I said so," he snapped, shocking the kid, who started to grow angry. "You're not my mom." Luffy dropped the crayons, got up and stormed out of the room. "If you would just listen to me, I wouldn't have to act like this, Yoi," Marco shouted after him, making some turn their head in shock towards him. "I won't," he shouted back, stomping past everyone in his way, heading towards his room. "Why won't you, Yoi?" Marco's voice raised a level in his anger. Luffy didn't give an answer to Marco. He continued to walk away from him towards his room, where he slammed his door in Marco's face. "Don't you dare slam that door at me, brat Yoi," he shouted. Whitebeard had watched the situation in worry. This was their very first fight. This would follow them forever. As their parent, how can he help them overcome this? "It sucks just watching," Thatch said beside his father, catching the older man's attention. "We can't get involved yet. We need to give them the chance to work this out on their own. If we try and intervene now, they will never know how to make up if this ever happens again. Luffy won't be staying with us forever either. Let this be a lesson for him in case he fights with other friends." Thatch smiled up at Pops, hoping to get his point across. Whitebeard just chuckled sadly at his children. "I shall wait then, my son," he said, and watched Marco throw his hands in the air and walk away mad. It had been a week now and nothing seemed to be getting better. Marco and Luffy wouldn't even look at each other at this point. The entire crew just felt wrong. Luffy without Marco felt wrong. It was as if everything was falling apart and no one knew how to stop it. Ace had had about enough of this. Luffy wasn't sleeping well, and him not sleeping made him cranky. The cranky Luffy was almost as annoying as a hyper Luffy. This needed to be settled now. Ace made eye contact with Sabo, who looked at him and nodded, understanding what needed to be done. "I get Marco, you get Luffy," Ace said, and they split off to do their work. Thatch, listening in on the two kids, walked up to them to stop them from interfering, but Sabo stopped Thatch before he could even say anything. "I get it that fights are going to happen. Heck, Ace and I have fought so many times I've lost count." He started. Thatch was curious as to where this was going. "Don't you think though that if this is their first real fight, they might not know how to make up from it? It's easy to argue but it's hard to forgive." Thatch was surprised about the amount of wisdom from the child and couldn't think of anything to counter his words. "We're going to see if we can show them, that's all," Ace said with a shrug, trying to be cool about the fact he didn't want them fighting. "Good luck," he could only reply, closing his eyes, hoping beyond hope these children could fix this. "We won't even need that," Sabo said with a grin. Ace headed off towards Marco's room and Sabo towards Luffy, who was pouting in his own room. When Ace knocked on the door, Marco opened it rather quickly, only to be disappointed that it wasn't Luffy. "I don't have time to play right now, I have way too much to do, Yoi," he said, ready to turn the kid away, but Ace was in his room sitting on the bed, crossing his arms and legs, glaring at Marco, who just sighed. "Fine, what is it?" he said, now sitting down on the chair, turning it to face Ace. "Stop fighting with Luffy," he said. Marco's eyes widened, then he glared at Ace. "And why should I, Yoi?" He was mad that Luffy was disobeying him like this. "Because what you're fighting over is stupid," Ace said in a bored voice. "And what would you know about our fight, Yoi?" he asked him, raising an eyebrow further than it already was. "I know that Luffy doesn't want to do chores, isn't that fine? I mean Sabo and I do enough to make up for him and there are lots of people on this ship doing work. Why make him do something he doesn't want to? You're pirates, right? Only Marines follow orders. Ace said, giving Marco a look as if calling him stupid. Yes, we're pirates, but rules have to be followed or everything will fall apart, especially since we do have a lot of people on this ship, Yoi. Marco countered, not wanting to admit he was starting to feel guilty after what Ace had just said. Ace rolled his eyes and stood up. Fine, whatever, but are you really going to risk your friendship with Luffy over a stupid thing like him not mopping the floor? If that's so, you really are the biggest idiot in the world. Ace left Marco there stunned before getting up and leaving him alone to his thoughts. Sabo found Luffy in his room sulking like he expected him to be. Hey, wanna talk? He asked a kid who just turned his head and pouted. Marco's an idiot. He said, not looking at Sabo, who just laughed softly. Yeah, I agree, but so are you. This brought him back toward Sabo. I'm not an idiot. Marco just won't listen to me. He kicked the bed in annoyance from where he was sitting. It must suck not being listened to. Sabo said, just staring at Luffy. MNN. He won't even try and understand me. It makes me so mad. He closed his eyes in frustration. He never asked you why you're angry, did he? Sabo asked him, making Luffy nod his head, glad someone understood why he was angry. Suo, let me get this straight, okay? You're angry at Marco because he won't listen to you and ask you why you don't want to do your chores, right? Sabo summarized for the kid. Man. He's being a big idiot. Luffy was happy to agree finally. I dunno, I think you're the bigger idiot here, Lou. He said, shaking his head in disappointment. The comment caught Luffy off guard. What do you mean I'm the bigger idiot? Marco's the idiot, not me. He was now angry at Sabo for not agreeing with him here. Don't you think that all the things you're angry at are the same things he's angry at? Did you ever ask him why he's mad? Did you ever ask him why he wants you to finish the chores he gave you? How about listening to him about anything at all? All I see is a brat throwing a tantrum. Sabo said rather coldly towards Luffy, who was now silent. Are you really going to throw away everything you have with Marco because you don't want to use a mop? Do you know what I'd give to have the relationship you have with Marco? Do you know what Ace would do to have that? Stop being an idiot, Luffy. He shouted and got up, letting the kid think about what was said, knowing Luffy though he probably wouldn't think that hard, but Sabo hoped something of his anger stuck with the kid. Ace and Sabo met up together and talked about what they had said and weren't surprised that they had said both similar things. Do you think they'll smarten up? Sabo asked Ace, who shrugged his shoulders. We've done our jobs, it's up to them now. They both looked out towards the water, hoping it all worked out. They liked Marco, and having him angry wasn't very fun for them either. Marco was in his room trying to do paperwork but was feeling rather awful. Ace's words had left a sting in his heart. Was he really throwing things away with Luffy? Was Luffy hurting because of this? Sure, the chores did need to be done, but maybe he was overreacting. He was ready to give up on his work when he heard a small knock at his door. Standing up, he opened up, surprised this time to see Luffy, his straw hat on his head and his old bear in his arms. Ma, he started, not sure what really to say. Marco opened the door wider, letting him in. Luffy went and sat on the bed holding the bear tighter. Do you hate me now, Ma? He set his head down and his hat covering his eyes. Marco wasn't sure where that had come from. Sure, they were fighting, but he had never said he hated the kid. I know I'm not listening, but I really don't want you to hate me. He said, his voice cracking from emotion. Marco just sighed, moving to sit beside Luffy on the bed, only for the kid to move away from him towards the wall. Marco frowned at this and pulled him back towards him. I don't hate you, kid, I just wish you would help out around the ship sometimes, Yoi. He said, hugging Luffy tightly. I don't like chores, he whined a bit. Marco smiled, trying to not say something stupid to push the kid away. He had known his anger had caused his little brother to feel sad. Why don't we try and compromise, Yoi? You help a little. Luffy opened his mouth to reject the idea of work, but Marco held up his hand to stop him. You help out a little here and there, I won't nag you. Just when asked to do something and I'll leave you be to play all you want. He said he just wanted to have the kid learn to be responsible. He was turning 9 soon, and their training sessions were still happening. Marco loved the fact that Luffy still played, but this was a ship and a pirate ship at that. The kid needed to grow a bit faster than normal to ensure his safety. Just a little bit? Luffy asked, hoping a little would just be all. Just a little, Yoi. He repeated, smiling. Fine, I guess I can do a little. Luffy sighed, not liking the idea of doing work. Marco laughed softly at him and held him tighter. And by the way, Lou, you're very loved, Yoi. By Pops, by Ace and Sabo, by the crew and especially by me. No matter what you do, where you go, I'll always love you, Yoi. Luffy smiled his widest smile and hugged Marco back full force. I love you too, Ma. And the fight was over. The two brothers had made up. When dinner rolled around, everyone could breathe a sigh of relief. Their brothers were back to being the way they loved them. Pop smiled and turned towards Thatch, glad his son knew what to do, but Thatch shook his head, confusing the older man. Ace and Sabo take the credit here, Pops. He said, nodding towards the two kids who grinned in triumph. I wanted to leave them alone, but those two convinced me that Marco and Luffy might not know how to make up from this. They did some sort of magic and we're back to happiness. Luffy got up from finishing his dinner and ran towards Thatch in excitement. Thatchy. Marco and I talked and I have to help a little bit with chores. So I decided to help you out in the kitchen. Luffy said excitedly. Thatch visibly paled. Luffy in the kitchen was never a good thing. That's great. He said, not sure what to do. I'll help tomorrow, okay? And with that he was off. Looks like we're going to starve, he whispered in fear, but when he looked towards the kid who had run back to Marco's arms, he couldn't bring himself to care about that. His family was whole once again and he wouldn't trade that for the world. Marco had brought Luffy and Ace down to the infirmary as soon as possible for the doctor to look over them. As soon as Dr. Myra saw the boys, she scooted Marco and Thatch out of the room so she could do her work without distractions. She checked Ace over, quickly cleaning and wrapping his injured hand, only to watch as the bandage caught flame. She glared at the hand annoyed, then looked up at Ace who just shrugged and grinned widely, his dark eyes dancing in the light. Can't help that. He said, smirking, though he dropped that smile with her stern look. Make another one go up in flames and you won't like what I do to you, young man. She said in a motherly but strict tone that caught Ace off guard. Yes, doctor. He said, looking away from her with a blush as she rewrapped his bandaged hand. Like your brother, you have a cracked rib, she said, examining him closer. Must have been when the guy threw me down. He remembered how he hit the deck rather harshly and the pain he felt all over from the injury. You'll need rest, but rest assured you'll be back up and moving again soon. She said, smiling at him, leading him over to a bed beside Sabo, who was happy to see at least one of his brothers. Where's Luffy? Sabo asked, worried for his younger brother. Surgery, his back's pretty messed up. Ace replied sadly, the guilt still there that Luffy was in this state because of him. What happened to his back? Sabo, who hadn't been on the ship, didn't know the extent of his injuries. From the looks of things he was whipped and beaten, Ace whispered softly, while Sabo's lips thinned out in a tight line. He'll be alright through, right? He asked Ace, who didn't say anything. He will be, he just needs a lot of rest. The doctor came in carrying Luffy in her arms. Luffy was fast asleep, his body wrapped in many bandages and a light robe wrapped around him to keep him warm. Ace got up quickly and opened the blankets for Luffy to be put into. He needs to sleep on his side or stomach since his back will be very sore. She said to the boys, knowing they would take care of the kid. Amen. Sabo nodded his head in understanding. I need to go report to Pops. Will you boys be alright here on your own? She asked them seriously while considering getting a nurse to look after them for a while. We'll be fine, we're more than enough for our brother. Sabo said, grinning at Ace, who smiled back. Alright, but if you need anything please ask. She said, waving to them and heading out to talk with the others. When she opened the door she couldn't help the sigh as the hallways was filled with many of the siblings, Marco, Thatch and Pops included. It was still raining outside so she would get the chance to speak to everyone indoors. They're alright. She said after they all moved somewhere more appropriate to talk. Luffy? One man called out amongst the siblings gathered. His back is very sore, he was whipped repeatedly by the looks of it. She started and waited a moment for everyone to settle down again. He was beaten a lot as well from the injuries he has. Ace as well was beaten pretty badly by the looks of things. Ace has a deep wound on his hand, but it shall heal nicely. He may have a small scar, but nothing too permanent will remain from this. She said to the men, everyone had heard about Sabo and his injuries, which caused them to act even more ferociously during the battle. Now they wished they had caused more damage to those men. Luffy and Ace will be fine though, Yoi? Marco asked her seriously. Physically they will all be okay, mentally I'm unsure. We all need to brace ourselves for the damage done to them. Nightmares, anxiety, fear, we need to be able to see them and help the boys heal from this. She said, which caused a lot of talking amongst the crew. But now that they're home and safe, won't all of those things disappear over time? Thatch asked seriously to the doctor. Unfortunately not. If they do have some form of trauma it won't ever really go away, at least not completely. It will be up to us as their family to help them through all of this no matter what. She said, looking directly towards Marco, who nodded his head, knowing that the task fell upon him to take care of Luffy. Thank you, child. How long will they be staying with you? Pops asked her. He had remained silent this entire time, listening carefully to the damage done to his youngest sons. Until I say they are fit to leave. And she left it like that. No one questioned her. Not now, not ever. Can I go visit them? Thatch asked carefully. Not now, they need rest, Luffy especially. Sabo needs to have his eye checked, and Ace has hopefully not burned anything to the ground. She sighed. Having the ASL trio in her care was going to drive her to drinking. She looked at the siblings around though and knew she couldn't keep them away forever. Tomorrow morning once they are awake, but you are all to follow my rules," she said with a sigh and was given a cheer in return. These were her siblings for better or for worse. Line break. "No one's coming for you kid ever again." Luffy's eyes snapped open, his heart was racing, and panic was flooding his veins. His breathing became more rapid, it almost felt like he was suffocating. Pushing himself up quickly and away from the bed, Ace moved into action. SHH, it's okay, we're home, we're safe," he said, trying to calm the kid down. Sabo was surprised by the wild panic in Luffy's eyes. "I can't breathe," Luffy said, grabbing his throat, which was enough for Sabo to call for a nurse, and one came running in fast. "What happening?" she asked seriously to the kids, then finally taking notice of Luffy and his panicked state. "He says he can't breathe." Ace almost screamed at her, and she nodded her head sadly. "Luffy, it's okay, nothing is going to happen to you. Take it slow, take a deep breath, everything will be okay," she said, taking hold of the kid's hands and forcing him to look at her. "Can you breathe again?" she asked him, and he just stared at her. What happened to me?" He was beginning to shake slightly. "Let's get you wrapped back up, then we can talk, okay?" she said kindly, and Sabo helped him back into his bed. "Sabo?" Luffy asked, looking at his brother for the first time. "I'm here, Lou," he said to the kid, but Luffy was still shaking. I'm sorry, he said softly, closing his eyes, trying to fight tears, his breath still coming in sharp gasps. "It's alright, there's nothing to be sorry about," the nurse said, wrapping him up as he got into a sitting position as comfortably as he could. "Do you want me to go get Marco?" she asked him, and he nodded slowly to her, closing his eyes. Ace watched the kid, taking notice to how pale he was. "What happened, Lou?" he asked quietly, trying not to startle him any more than he already was. "Nightmare," was all he said, pulling the blanket closer, and Ace nodded his head in understanding. "We're home now, nothing can hurt us," Ace said softly to the kid sitting on his bed and taking hold of his hand. "Ops and Marco and the others rescued us," he said with a grin, and felt a bit relieved when Luffy opened his eyes to look at him. "Sabo's okay," he said, and Sabo laughed. "I've suffered worse than that, trust me," he said, and Luffy looked at him and the bandage over his face. "What happened to your face?" Luffy asked, tilting his head, the shaking all but gone. "Fire from the gunshot burned me," he said, placing a hand on his bandage. "Does it hurt?" Sabo nodded his head. "Yeah, a lot, but the doctor lady said it will heal." He smiled towards Luffy, who smiled weakly back to him. "I'm going to have an epic scar," he said with a grin that caused the brothers to laugh and Ace to flare up a bit. Luffy looked at him, his mouth opened wide in shock, but then a grin appeared on his face in excitement. "You're fire," he said, and Ace gave his signature grin back. "Yup, now I can burn down anything that pisses me off," he said, only to receive a smack on the back of the head. "Language brat," Thatch said, entering the room with Marco right behind him. "Sorry, Thatch." Ace chuckled out, but still grinning. "Thatch, Marco. Ace is fire," Luffy said, pointing his finger towards his brother. "Yeah, we figured that's what you were. How are you feeling, Luffy yoy?" Marco asked, sitting down on the bed beside the kid while Thatch sat on Ace's bed. "I'm sore and my back really hurts," he said. The nurse had put a pillow behind him to keep his back safe, but it still was painful to really rest on it. "I heard you had a bit of panic, are you really okay?" Thatch said, looking at Luffy, who looked down, his eyes shadowing over Marco, didn't like how the chocolate brown in Luffy's eyes looked a bit darker. "I had a nightmare," was all he needed to say for Marco to wrap an arm around him carefully. "Once you're out of here, would you like to sleep in my room, yoy?" he asked, knowing he could give Luffy comfort, but Luffy shook his head no. "I want to stay with my brothers," was all he really said. Marco's eyes widened a fracture, and even Thatch stood still. "You sure? Ace and Sabo can stay with me, you know," Thatch said to Luffy, but it was Sabo who intervened. "We appreciate your offers, both of you, but let us be with him for now," Sabo said, smiling at the grown men who just sighed and nodded their heads. "Alright, but if they get worse, you're staying with me, yoy," Marco said, finalizing the argument, if you would call it that. "Man," Luffy chirped out, feeling a lot better now, though his body still hurt. The fearful feelings had passed. "Do you guys want to talk about what happened?" Thatch asked them. Luffy looked away and Ace frowned deeply. "No," they both said, not really in the mood to relive the nightmare of that ship. "Alright, but I do want to hear your stories at some point, okay?" Thatch said softly to them and got a nod in return. "Time for your medication, boys," the doctor said, coming into the room, hand on her hip, her brown hair pulled into a French braid down her back. She had Luffy on a small amount of painkillers and was on antibiotic for his back. Ace had to take antibiotics and was given an injection of medication to protect himself from infections. Sabo needed his bandages changed and creams put on his eye every couple of hours to ensure it healed properly. "La, I hate medicine," Luffy shouted to no one, and Marco chuckled. "But it will help you heal faster, yoy." He ruffled Luffy's hair affectionately, making the kid cuddle into the hand. Sabo was getting head bandages removed, making Ace and Luffy actually see the injury for the first time. Sabo, Ace said softly, looking at the burn that covered his eye. "I'm alright, it doesn't hurt as bad as it looks, it's really actually more itchy than anything," he said, shrugging his shoulders. "It'll make me look cooler too. Pops has lots of scars and he's super strong," Sabo said excitedly while Thatch rolled his eyes. "Even if it makes you look, what was the word? Cooler, you'll always be just a brat to me," he said, hugging the kid tightly as Sabo tried to squirm out of his arms. "Time to let them rest. Out the both of you, I said you could visit in the morning and only made an acceptation for now because Luffy wanted you. You can visit them properly like everyone else tomorrow," she said, glaring at the commanders who stood up knowing she had the power to hurt them should they disobey her. "You're leaving," Luffy said, panic rising once again in his little body. "Yes, Lou, but we'll be back again in the morning. It's about 2 am and we both need some sleep, and so do you, kid," Thatch said, putting his forehead onto Luffy's in a calming gesture. "We will be back as soon as possible, try and get some sleep, you've got 2 big strong brothers watching over you tonight, Yoi," Marco said, placing a kiss on top of Luffy's head. "Night, brats," Thatch called back, waving to them as the doctor got them into their proper beds. "Get some good rest, boys, tomorrow your many siblings will want to talk with you," she said, shaking her head but smiling. Ace crawled into his bed and turned himself onto his back to look at the ceiling. Luffy turned himself onto his stomach so he wouldn't hurt his sore back, but it was Sabo who got up and crawled into Luffy's bed. "What are you doing?" the doctor said, giving the blonde a look. "Keeping Luffy safe," was all he said before climbing under the blankets and putting an arm carefully around Luffy. Ace, getting the hint, grabbed his blanket and went to Luffy's bed as well. "We'll protect him from anything," Ace said, throwing his arm over Luffy as well, protecting him in a warm cocoon. "Ace, Sabo," Luffy whispered, but smiled at the warmth from his big brothers falling asleep with no more nightmares to be found. Line break. It had been a week since the brats were back and finally they were allowed to be released from the infirmary. The crew partied the rest of the day in celebration and carefully followed the doctor's orders that the kids were to rest as often as possible. Luffy ate as much food as possible, telling anyone who would listen how he was super brave and stood up to the mean pirate. Ace told the pieces that Luffy forgot about and even some of his own story to the many siblings that listened. Sabo's eye was scared, but he thought it looked cool. He told Ace that he was considering growing his hair longer when the nurses asked the boys if they would like their haircut before being released. Luffy laughed, saying he would look like a girl. Ace agreed, but said Sabo should do what he liked when Sabo punched them both over the head for the comments made. The crew felt right having the brothers back in good spirits. Their laughter was loud, and when they smiled many of the crew members found themselves smiling along with them. "They're so cheerful," Vista said, smiling under his mustache. "I'm glad, I was worried for a while," Thatch commented back. He had been worried after Luffy's panic attack that night, so Marco and himself had been watching the kid. They were happy to hear that no other attack had happened, but the nightmares were still there. Marco said they would deal with those as they came and that's what they would do. "When are you heading out, Yoi?" Marco said to Thatch, who had a backpack by his feet filled with useful items. "Shortly, just saying bye to the brats," he said, grinning. Luffy, who heard Thatch was leaving, came running straight to him, throwing his arms around the older man. "Don't go," he said softly to Thatch, who kneeled down to hug him tighter. "I won't be long, just a short mission, I'll be back in no time," he said, but Luffy didn't let him go. "Don't go," he repeated to Thatch, who sighed. "I have to, it's my job as the 4th commander to Golu. I heard this island has a devil fruit on it, of course that's just rumors, but still worth checking out while I'm there." He laughed, but Luffy refused to let go. "I'll be safe, kid, I won't eat anything like that till I get home. I'm not quite sure I want to be an anchor quite yet, you know." Marco pulled Luffy off of him and into his arms. "Just come home safe, Yoi," Marco said, and Thatch smiled widely to his brother and best friend. "Of course." Ace and Sabo followed behind Luffy and Marco, waving goodbye as Thatch and a few of his division set off to complete their mission, not knowing that the storm would follow them home. Thatch was considering a roasted phoenix was in order when he got back from this damned mission. The stupid crew that was pushing their luck had decided to not just rip Pop's flag down from its proud spot, but it also stepped all over it right in front of his eyes. The reason he was considering roasting Marco was because Marco promised this would be a simple mission. Really though, this mission was about to turn into a bloodbath and he might have felt a tinge of pity for the other guys, but really he didn't. When they arrived on the island they expected a welcome of some sort but was greeted with nothing but silence. Thatch was admittedly disappointed. He enjoyed the cheers, the welcoming, and the kindness. He expected this time to get cries of relief upon their arrival, so when they heard nothing his guard went up. "Team 1, find the civilians and make sure they are as okay as possible," he said to one group of people. "Team 2, search for the escape routes of the enemy and block them off any way you can." He pointed to another group who nodded. Team 3, when I give the signal, cause as much destruction as you can. This will cause confusion among the enemy and give us a leg up. He said and got a feral grin from those people. Team 4, you're coming with me. We're going to search for the enemy and bring them out. Each team has a transponder snail to keep in contact with one another. Let's get this over with and done so we can get home faster. He said to the men as the ship was docked and all were ready for action. Pan out, find the source of the problem, report to me. Don't act alone, don't fight alone, be quiet and cause no disturbances unless you're ordered to, got it men? Thatch said to his division softly but sternly, knowing full well that the enemy already probably knew they were there. For once in his life Thatch wanted to be wrong. He knew the enemy knew he was there, but had hoped that they might have a bit of surprise under them. Unfortunately he knew he wasn't that lucky. Well, what do we have here? One man said, stepping in front of Thatch, who just rolled his eyes. Looks to me like one of them Manders. Another said with his thick accent that Thatch didn't actually recognize. And what of it? He asked, placing his hand on his beloved katana, knowing full well he would be using it shortly. I thought the All-Man would send someone of higher rank to fight us, instead he sends his fourth. The man laughed and Thatch's brow twitched in annoyance. Trust me when I say that the old man doesn't need to send anyone stronger than me to kill you. Thatch said with a grin before whistling softly, giving the signal. He smiled widely while unsheathing his blade, showing the pirates that he was only just beginning. Sending Marco would worry our brat, and we can't have that happening now, not after everything he's been through. He glared up at the men. Now why don't we have some fun? Line break. When's Thatch coming back? Luffy begged again to Marco, who was trying to keep his calm. Tomorrow morning at the latest, Lou, all will be okay, Yoi. Though the boy didn't look convinced at all. I want him home now. He shouted once again. Marco had been having this exact conversation with Luffy countless times throughout the day. He honestly wasn't sure if he should just go bring his brother home himself to stop this problem once and for all. We all do, Luffy, but he'll be home when he gets home. He wouldn't want to worry you, so have faith in him, Yoi. Marco said, hugging the kid. Does feel weird, he said, holding his stomach and frowning slightly, which worried Marco. The whole crew was slightly on edge since Luffy had refused to smile ever since Thatch left. Luffy, the kid that was always smiling, was now not, and this hadn't happened in years. Do you want to go see the nurse, Yoi? Marco said, kneeling down to Luffy's eye level. Nah, I want to see Pops. He said and wandered off to find the old man to cuddle with. Luffy. Pop said as the boy climbed his leg and curled up on his lap. I don't feel right, he said sadly to his father, who looked down at him, carefully analyzing the child for any problems. What do you mean, child? He asked, still searching for any source of problems on the kid. I'm not sick or anything, just don't feel right, you know. He said, rolling onto his back to look up into the old man's golden eyes with his own brown ones. When your brother gets home everything will be fine, have faith, little one. He said, but Luffy gave a weird look to the old man, a spark of anger in his brown eyes that surprised Pops greatly. Everyone keeps saying that like I don't have any faith. He's my brother too, you know. He shouted, shocking those who were around the kid and old man. Marco raised a brow further up his face, not used to Luffy shouting at Pops or anyone really. I know, Luffy, we didn't mean it like that. We know you have faith in your brother, we just need to believe he will come home safely, that is all. He said, tickling the kid's exposed belly. Rolling on his side away from his father's tickling fingers, Luffy looked out towards the sea. I know, I just don't feel right, that's all. Line break back to THATCH. Thatch was breathing heavily. These men were a bit stronger than they looked, he'd give them that, but then again so was he. You probably cracked a rib of mine. He said with a laugh, glaring at the last man standing. His division worked well and quickly. And you broke my arm into pieces. The other guy said with the same feral grin, holding his arm as blood dripped down from a sliced wound on his shoulder. Ready for more? Thatch said, standing up, pointing his blade at the man who laughed. What's the point? I know a loss when I see it. He said, and Thatch smiled darkly to him. Did you really expect me to let you live after you shot down our flag? Only the brave or the stupid would burn down a flag of such great importance. He said, bringing his sword up into position. You are worthy of your title, commander of the 4th Division, the man said finally, as Thatch brought down his katana, slicing the man's throat, the body slumping forward. Just as you were worthy to die by my blade. He said, staring down at the dead man, putting his blade away. It wasn't the first time or the last that Thatch had killed someone, but he truly hated doing it. Commander, we found the civilians. One man said, coming towards Thatch. He was covered in blood but looked happy to have the fight over with. I'll go to them, just point me the right way. He said, knowing that he was probably the most clean out of the men. Are you sure, Thatch? He said, and Thatch laughed loudly to his brother. Of course. If they see you looking like that you'd scare them. He said, heading in the direction of the civilians. When he found them, they were all cornered into a forest, hiding behind the trees and the children in bushes. Don't worry, all of you. Thatch shouted to them, hoping to catch their attention. The island is safe, you are free once more. He said, smiling at them when a loud cheer was cried out. We can return home? A child asked, walking up to Thatch, who grinned down at the kid. My man and I will help you as best as we can, you're under our old man's protection after all. The child laughed loudly and grabbed Thatch's hand, pulling him forwards back towards the village. During the time he went to free the people, his team had cleaned the area as best as they could, disposing of the bodies of the dead crew and burning the old ship. Looks like we got a lot to do, but I'm positive we can get this done by nightfall. He said, looking at the mess around town. Don't worry yourself too much, Commander. An old man said, walking towards him without any fear. Ah. Mr. Mayor, I'm glad you're not hurt. He said, smiling. Pops like this man, he gave good drinks every once in a while. I would be dead if it wasn't for you and this crew, you have our thanks. He said, bowing his head to Thatch, who felt very awkward about receiving any praise. Don't sweat it, I'm still a pirate, it's just the old man likes this island, so it's my job as his son to protect it. He said, putting his hands up, trying to get the man to stop bowing his head. They came for a reason, you know. The mayor said after a moment, catching Thatch's attention. I heard a rumor, is it true? He whispered in return, getting a sad nod from the man. You saved us once again when we were not strong enough. If you wish for it, it is yours. He said, and Thatch nodded, slowly taking in everything. What type of fruit is it? He asked softly, but the older man shook his head. I've no clue, I have only heard bad things about it and don't want it sitting in my village any longer. I know I say I am giving it as a gift when really I am giving it away to bring myself relief. Am I selfish to do this? Who knows, I feel you will have a better time deciding what to do with it than I, an old man. I'll talk with Pops and we'll figure it out, don't worry. Thatch said reassuringly to the old man, who smiled gratefully in return. Then I shall send you and your men back with the finest of alcohol for the old man as thanks for both matters this day. Thatch grinned and waved in response. Looks like things are going to get interesting, huh? A devil fruit that no one likes, wonder what we should do with it. Thatch pondered out loud, his ribs killing him from the fight, but his responsibility to help these people came first. Oh well, Pops will know what to do. He said before walking over to join his family, helping to repair the damage before setting sail back home, never knowing that the bad feeling was growing stronger in Luffy's gut. Bonus. Ma. May I? Luffy shouted in Marco's ear as he lay in bed trying to sleep after pulling an all-nighter. Luffy, please, I'm trying to sleep, Yoi. He said, covering his eyes with his hand from the damned sun and its bright rays. But you've been sleeping forever. He pouted, flopping down onto the man's stomach, making him groan in response. I was up all night, Lou, give me a break, Yoi, he said, sitting up to look at the kid who was on his back, looking up at Marco with big brown eyes. I wanna play though. He whined out and Marco just yawned. Then go find your brothers, brat, I'm still tired, Yoi. He said, but knew he was getting up soon with the look Luffy just gave him. But I wanna play with you, he said sadly, and Marco sighed. Go ask Thatcher Ace, they might have something for you to play with, Yoi. He said, laying back down. Luffy looked at him blankly before a smile came over his face. Sure, that sounds like a good idea, he said, his smile getting wider by the moment and his eyes sparked with mischievousness. Whatever he had planned, Marco wasn't going to like it. The kid hopped off of Marco and bolted out the door, laughter filling the air, and he groaned, worried about what he had just set loose on the ship. Marco waited an hour and a half for something to happen, but when nothing did, he sighed in relief, allowing himself to slowly drift back into a peaceful sleep. Once he felt completely relaxed, his door banged open loudly, startling him awake. Marco? What do you mean all of my finished paperwork is gone? Thatch said in a panic, waking the tired phoenix up completely. What are you talking about, Yoi? He asked Thatch, who started to enter his room. Ace said that you told him to tell me that my paperwork is missing. I worked really hard on that. Please, I'm begging you, don't make me do it all over again. It's got to be here somewhere. He said, taking a step towards Marco's desk, but the man was faster. It's here, I promise, Yoi. He said, hoping to stop Thatch from destroying his organized desk. Then why did Ace say that? He questioned, calming down as Marco pulled the paperwork from its folder, as proof it was there. I know that's quite weird of him, Yoi, but Marco had a fairly good idea what was going on. Thatch waved and apologized to Marco before leaving, giving the man a chance to fully wake up before another one came to his door. Marco, my blade is missing. Vista said, panic clear in his eyes. Then why are you coming to me, Yoi? He said, his brow twitching in annoyance. Sabo said you saw what happened to it. Vista put his hand on his hip and looked at Marco expectantly. I guess I can help, but I don't actually know where it is, Yoi. Marco sighed, this was going to be a long day. Looking around in the most obvious spots and asking around, the blade was found, and Vista apologized to Marco for disturbing him. Marco thought he could relax now that that was done, but it seemed his other siblings wanted answers as well. Marco spent the best part of that afternoon helping his siblings find their lost property as they all came right to him, saying that one of the brats had told them he knew the answers. "That it when I find those three I'm going to teach them a lesion yoi. Yes, a lesion on why they shouldn't play this game ever again." When he did find the brats they were all laying on the floor with plates around them that appeared to once have cookies on them and pictures of well Marco wasn't actually sure. "They've been waiting for you to find them for a long time." Marco looked up to see Pop standing over him. "They wanted me to find them yoi?" he asked his father confused. Of course after all this was a grand game of hide and seek. He laughed and Marco smiled in defeat. "Brats, that what you all are, nothing but a bunch of adorable, annoying, lovable brats yoi," he said bending down and kissing Luffy on the cheek. Luffy opened his eyes softly looking slowly up at Marco. "Ah. You found us," he said happily throwing his arms around the man who laughed softly returning the hug. "What?" Sabo said rubbing his eyes and pushing on Ace to wake him up. "Ah. Marco took you long enough," Ace said looking up at the man a smirk on his freckled face. "And whose idea was this yoi?" Pop smiled at the scene taking place. "Luffy's." Both Sabo and Ace said pointing at the kid who laughed his shishishi. "I told them we were gonna play hide and see with ya and they thought up the rest. You did tell me to go ask Ace to play with me." Luffy smiled making Marco proud that they were able to pull this off and amazed at their teamwork to do so. "Thanks for playing with us ma," Luffy said to his brother who just sighed and smiled back at the kids. "No problem yoi. This was his family for better or for worse and he wouldn't have it any other way." Thatch could see the Moby Dick in the distance and couldn't help the smile from spreading over his face. Home was all that was needed to be said for the tired division to brighten up. Marco was leaning on the railing when he saw Thatch's small ship sailing closer to them and felt a sense of relief spread over him at the return of his brother. "Luffy, Thatch is home yoi," he called over to the kid who jumped up from his place on the figurehead and raced to Marco's side. Marco pointed his finger towards the coming ship and for the first time in a day Luffy smiled. "About time, he's late," Ace accused following Luffy over to Marco. Ace and Sabo had been very worried about their little brother the entire time and while they wanted to cheer him up, they didn't quite know how. Sabo was still off balance with his eye being constantly looked at and cleaned and Ace was bursting into flames at any given moment. They almost made Luffy smile when Sabo thought up the idea of roasting marshmallows on Ace's flames. Ace thought it was a great idea until the treat ended up melting on him, resulting in a sticky mess and a bath. When the ship was close enough to home Thatch jumped up to the railing of the Moby Dick and smiled to see his siblings surrounding him. "Now this is a proper welcoming," he said happily as Luffy tackled him into a hug. "I missed you," he whispered into Thatch's coat tears brimming on his lashes. "I'm home kid, I'm home," he said softly and looked to see Sabo and Ace standing a little bit away looking rather awkward. Picking Luffy up he then walked to the boys and pulled them into a one-armed hug. "Geez, don't just stand there. I expect to be loved greatly when I return home from a hard mission," he said dramatically and Sabo successfully escaped Thatch's arms, but Ace was pulled tighter. "Hard mission yoi?" Marco said looking at Thatch who growled at the phoenix. "They were stronger than they looked. You're lucky I'm not craving phoenix or you'd be on the menu tonight brother," Thatch said playfulness in his eyes and Marco grinned back at him. "I don't think phoenix tastes very good anyways yoi," he replied while drool started to pour down Luffy's face. Meat. Both men looked at the little kid and Marco paled slightly. "Don't give him any ideas Thatcher, I'll have your head yoi." Everyone couldn't help but laugh glad to have everyone home. "Commander. I'll take this ship back to where it belongs." One of the members called from the small ship. Thatch nodded his head and waved as it sailed off back to the island it belonged on. "Can I give you my report later? I have something I need to discuss with the old man," Thatch said letting Ace finally go and putting Luffy down. "Is it important enough to skip on your paperwork yoi?" Marco asked him seriously. "The rumors about the devil fruit were true. I need to talk with the old man on what to do with it," he said pointing down at the box by his feet that held the unknown fruit. Luffy was watching his brothers talk but felt unsure. Something about the box felt bad, felt wrong and was making his stomach hurt again. He didn't like the box and hoped it went away somewhere else so he never had to see it again. "You found a devil fruit," a voice said and Thatch turned towards the large man who was eating a pie standing by the wall. "Yeah, don't know what it does yet though," Thatch said smiling at Teach and greeting not noticing how Luffy grabbed hold of Ace's arm tightly. Ace looked down at the kid worried not sure what was spooking him so badly. "Luffy," he whispered and nudged Sabo to look at the kid. Surprise hit Sabo's face, quickly seeing Luffy pale and frightened was new. "Hey Lou, let's go play somewhere else K," Sabo said kneeling down in front of the boy breaking his attention from the box and from Teach being so close to him. "Yeah, let's go finish those pictures we were working on." Ace agreed, pulling Luffy away from the crowd of people, hoping to dispel any of the bad emotions he was feeling. Once away from the group, Ace turned to his little brother and watched him carefully. "What's wrong?" he said to the boy, who looked down, his straw hat shadowing his eyes, making them look darker than the boys knew they were. "I don't feel right," he said, and both the boys had heard him say that the past day. "How don't you feel right?" Sabo questioned him further. "No, just don't," he said, sitting down and looking up at the clouds. A storm was coming, and this time it would hit hard. Line break. "So that's what happened on that island," Pop said, sitting on his bed listening to his son tell the story of his mission. "They gave me the fruit in hopes that no one else will come for it on that island," he said, patting the box carefully, not really liking the idea of being too close to it. "What are you planning on doing with it, Yoi?" Marco asked him, sitting in a chair beside his best friend. No, really, I don't want it. Might sell it off, I guess," he said, not really wanting to be an anchor. The crew had enough anchors on it, so he might as well be the hero that saves them when they fall in the ocean, or in Luffy's case dive into it. "Let us think carefully about this, my sons. We will explore every option available before taking action." The men nodded their heads, agreeing. "Thatch, hold on to the fruit for now, keep it somewhere safe until I have decided what we should do with it," he said to his son, who smiled and stood up. "I'm tired and in need of a bath, so I'll take my leave." He waved to his father and Marco before heading to drop the fruit off in his room, not seeing the dark shadow watching him from afar. "Line break." "Thatchy," a small voice said from his bedroom door, making him turn quickly to see Luffy peeking through. "Luffy, why aren't you with Ace and Sabo?" he asked the kid, inviting him into the room. "I want to be with you," he said softly to his brother, and Thatch smiled down at him. "I'm in need of a bath, kid. I know you're not that fond of them, but how about taking one with me?" he said to Luffy, who just grabbed onto his leg, hugging him tightly. "I want to stay with Thatch," Luffy said once again, so Thatch picked him up, bringing him to eye level. "Then let's go take a bath, brat." Luffy wrapped his arms around Thatch's neck and hugged him tightly, his straw hat hanging down on his back. Luffy was playing with Sabo and Ace for a while, but the nagging feeling in his gut kept saying for him to be with Thatch. Even being with Marco didn't stop the feeling that something was wrong from consuming him. Commander Luffy heard the voice of someone he didn't really want to see right this moment, so he buried his head in Thatch's neck. "Teach, it's getting late," Thatch said, looking at the man in question. "Just wondering, Commander, what you doing with that fruit you found?" he asked, smiling at Luffy, who just buried his head a little deeper. Op said he'd decide, "For now I'll hold on to it to keep it safe," he said, confused on how Teach knew so much about the fruit in the first place. "I see, little Luffy okay there?" he asked, pointing to the kid who was curling into Thatch more and more. "I heard he hasn't been feeling well," Thatch said, holding the kid tighter. "Yes, he didn't smile even once while you were gone, zahahaha," Teach said, patting Luffy's hair, missing the shiver that went through the kid's body. "Well, that's unusual. Who's on watch tonight?" Thatch looked around for the team that would protect the ship during the night. I am, me and some others from the 2nd Division," he said, rubbing his hair and smiling widely. "I see, well, take care, I think a storm's going hit tonight." Thatch excused himself from Teach, leaving the man to smile and laugh. "You as well, Commander, zahahaha." When they got to the bathroom, Luffy was silent for the most part while Thatch helped the kid undress before undressing himself. "Do you want to talk about it, kid?" Thatch asked, stepping into the bath while Luffy sat on the edge, dipping his feet into it only. "I know what to talk about," he said, feeling his energy drain more and more. "How about what's really bothering you?" he said, but Luffy shook his head. "Nothing is bothering me, I just feel wrong," he said, trying to think of the words but still not coming out right. "What do you mean wrong?" he asked him seriously, seeing the kid frown. "Like something bad is coming and I don't know what," he said, looking into Thatch's eyes seriously. "Well, let's get you all cleaned up and we'll have some fun to scare that bad feeling away now, won't we, kid?" Thatch said, pulling Luffy into the bath to wash his black hair. Man, something fun sounds nice." Once the bath was finished and dinner eaten, Luffy was in some warm fluffy pajamas. They decided to cuddle in Thatch's bed while the older brother read him some stories. Ace and Sabo let Luffy be, knowing that if they couldn't help him then at least one of the commanders would. Marco was worried about the kid since he hadn't let Thatch out of his sight since he got home. He knew Thatch probably loved the attention, so he didn't interfere, but he felt something off about the attachment. Once they finished the book, Luffy decided he was going to be sleeping in the room with him that night. Thatch rolled his eyes but didn't fight the kid. If it made him less worried, then why not? Thatch was right about the storm hitting. It was just beginning to drizzle when the loud thunder struck, waking Luffy. "Thatchy," Luffy whispered, grabbing his older brother's hand, trying to wake him up. What? Lou? What's wrong, buddy?" Thatch asked sleepily. It was just past midnight. "I'm scared," he said, and Thatch was just about to comfort him when a loud bang hit the door, making Luffy pull the blankets up closer to him and Thatch to turn his head towards the noise. That's the monster from my dream. Luffy said, remembering the nightmare that had actually waked him in the first place. Stay there, bud. Luffy didn't want to see the monster, so he pulled the blankets up over his head and closed his eyes tight. But the Thatch said, annoyed, opening his door to see Teach standing there, a grin on his face. Teach. I thought you were supposed to be on watch. Thatch said, annoyed that it was him that woke them up. I am Commander, I was just wondering. What are you going to do with that devil fruit of yours? He said, pushing the commander back into the room. Thatch, a seasoned fighter, got into a defense stance in case he needed to fight. I'm going to throw it in the damn sea, now get out. He said, pushing the large man towards his door, but Teach was stronger and pushed Thatch sideways towards the wall. Pulling a knife from his sash and stabbing Thatch in the back, Thatch cried out as blood began to pool through his cloths. Realizing that he needed to turn himself to avoid as much damage as possible, Teach was able to remove the knife, and Thatch's wound was not as deep as it looked. I'll be taking this, Commander. Teach said, grabbing the box with the devil fruit before turning to the boy in the bed. Thanks for not screaming, little Luffy, you really helped me out a lot there, zahahaha. He said before closing the door and disappearing off into the stormy night. Luffy was in shock. He sat there and stared as Thatch's blood begun to surround him on the floor. Realizing he needed to do something, Luffy jumped up and put his hands on the wound. Stop bleeding. Saint, stop. 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 He screamed, tears streaming down his face. He didn't know what to do. He was scared and alone. He wanted his pops. Luffy bolted in the pouring rain to the closet's room, to him, his father's. Banging loudly on the door and screaming as loud as he could, the old man opened the door in a panic and felt his heart stop when saw his youngest son with blood all over his hands and knees, crying in the rain. Luffy, what has happened? He said, kneeling down, searching frantically for any injury. Thatch. Thatch needs help now. He screamed, pulling the older man's hand, trying to drag him to the room. Luffy, go wake your family, I'll help Thatch. Pop said, moving quickly towards the room, fear building up. Luffy didn't waste any time. He knocked on every door and screamed help to anyone who opened them. What's going on, Yoi? Marco asked, hearing commotion outside his door. He looked and saw Luffy running towards him, grabbing his leg, pulling him forward. Luffy, what's wrong, Yoi? He said, looking down at the kid, seeing the blood on his knees. What happened, Yoi? He began to panic and pulled Luffy close to him to search. Thatch was stabbed by Teach. He cried out while Marco held the kid's shoulders, holding him still as he cried. Luffy? Ace was there. He had been woken up by one of the crewmates who had taken over Luffy's job at waking everyone up. Stay with him, Ace, Yoi. Marco said, passing the child over to Ace, who wrapped his arms around the shaking little boy. Sabo standing protectively behind them, watching everything. Marco, satisfied that Luffy was safe, made his way to Thatch's room quickly, just like everyone else. What happened? Haruta asked as the nurses and the doctor worked frantically stabilizing Thatch and getting him down to the infirmary. Don't know, just heard Luffy screaming, Aizu said, looking around trying to see what the problem could have been. Luffy said, Teach stabbed Thatch, Yoi. Marco said, arriving into the conversation, causing brows to rise. That's a pretty harsh accusation, Haruta said seriously, but knew fully that Luffy could not lie to save his life. Will he live, Yoi? Marco asked the doctor, who had her hair tied in a messy bun rather than her normal French braid. Damn straight he will. I'm the doctor, and if I say he will, then he will. She said, glaring at Marco as if he was stupid. I've been on this ship for a very long time, Marco. His wound is deep, but not the worst stabbing in the history of this ship. He will live, I'll ensure it. She said, turning to look at her father with confidence dancing in her eyes. If not for all of us, but for Luffy, I'll make sure he lives to see tomorrow and many more after that. Marco took a deep breath, hoping beyond hope that her words were true. Looking towards the straw hat sitting on Thatch's desk, he felt like crying. Hadn't their brat been through enough? Hadn't he seen enough? Why now of all damn times? Taking another deep breath, he made his way back to Luffy, who he knew was going to need another bath. The storm had hit, the lightning had struck. Now all they could do was hope a rainbow formed after all of this mess. Luffy was sitting on a chair in the room he shared with his brothers as they helped him clean himself up. Ace had gotten a bucket of warm water and a cloth from the nurses, and Sabo had just talked with Luffy, hoping he would respond to anything at all. Marco had Luffy's hat since he had left it in Thatch's room, and Luffy was in no hurry to return there. Do you want to talk about it? Sabo asked him finally. He had been avoiding that particular question for a while now, since he was not sure how it would affect the boy. Nua? Luffy said, looking at the floor, his mind still playing everything back, going over what had happened that night. Thatch will be alright. Ace said confidently, dropping the cloth into the murky water and pushing the bucket away before looking up at Luffy. Luffy wouldn't lift his head. He was so far into it he barely heard what Ace said at all. Sighing, Ace stood up and carefully lifted Luffy's chin up to look him in the eyes. Thatch will live. He said sternly to his brother, holding his gaze to reassure him. Damn straight he will, Yoi. Marco said from the doorway holding the straw hat in his hand looking at the kid softly. Marco wanted to leave, to chase after Teach and give him the punishment he deserved, but the old man told him to wait. Marco had been the 1st Division commander for a really long time, and he didn't get there by disobeying his captain and father. When Pop said for him to wait to let him watch things carefully, then he would listen, even if he didn't exactly like it. He knew that right now Luffy would need him most, and throwing a tantrum over this situation wasn't helping anyone. No one had gone back to bed after the incident, and really who could blame them? One of their own had been attacked by someone they considered a brother. Something like this had never happened before, and they would be making sure it never happened again. How do you know? Luffy finally said, still looking at Ace. His chocolate eyes were watery and red rimmed from crying, but there was a seriousness there mixed with worry that made Ace watch him harder. Because he's our brother. Sabo said, firmly, making pride fill Marco's chest at the boy's words. That's right, Yoi. He said, kneeling down to Luffy's level and placing the hat back on the kid's head, hoping that would relax him some. Nah, can I have some time with Luffy alone for a bit, Yoi? He asked the two boys who had been guarding the kid for the past few hours. Ace and Sabo exchanged looks before sighing in defeat. Sure, we're going to go see if we can help with anything else. Sabo said, grabbing his top hat from the dresser in the room. I'm going to go help in the kitchen, they'll need whatever help they can there. Ace said and waved as he left. Marco knew that he would be passing the kid back to the boys later, but for now he needed to be with the kid himself. Thatch is hurt, but he shall survive, Yoi. Marco said to Luffy, softly sitting him down on his bed before sitting beside him, pulling him close. But what if he's really hurt? Luffy whispered out, staring at the wall. He is really hurt, but he was able to avoid a lot of other damage. Thatch is smart, he's strong, and he's our brother, Yoi. Marco said, hugging the boy tightly, putting his chin on Luffy's head. He's also my best friend, so he has to be alright, Yoi. Marco barely whispered, but Luffy caught it, his eyes widening after hearing the shake in Marco's voice. Marco had always been Luffy's rock, his strength when something was scary, wrong, sad, happy and exciting. For Luffy to hear his ma sound so unsure and even scared reminded him that he wasn't the only one hurting right now. Ma, I should have done something. He said, a tear slipping past his defenses, and Marco lifted his chin away from the kid's head to look at him. You did enough, you saved Thatch's life, Yoi. He said to Luffy, but the kid shook his head. I should have screamed or fought back. I should have done something, anything. He remembered Teach thanking him for not screaming, and it had bothered him greatly. If you had screamed, Teach might have killed you and Thatch would have died, Yoi. He said, silencing the kid. You did more than enough, Luffy, you saved your brother's life, Yoi. Marco said, and let Luffy finally cry everything out. Marco held the kid as he cried for being too young to fight, he cried for only being able to watch Thatch fall, and cried for not being strong enough to stop it from happening. Marco held the kid and whispered understandings and encouragements until Luffy had cried himself to sleep in Marco's arms. How is he? A strong voice said from the doorway, making Marco look away from the kid towards his father. He's sad, but he will heal as Thatch heals, Yoi. Marco placed the sleeping boy into his bed and pulled the covers up over him to keep him warm. Leaving the room, he found his siblings talking, eating or heading back to bed themselves. How's Thatch, Yoi? Marco asked hesitantly, knowing the nurses and doctor had to have been working hard to save Thatch. Pop sat down on his throne and sighed, looking towards the sea. He's alive and Myra plans to keep him that way. Thatch's injuries are bad but not lethal as they should have been. You were right when you said Luffy saved his life, if the kid hadn't have been there you would have lost a brother that night. He said, and Marco nodded in understanding. I hope this is it, Yoi. I hope that nothing else happens now to our brats, they've suffered enough lately. He said, looking at the blue waves as well before leaving his father to try and rest a bit. Line break. When Luffy woke up, it was mid-afternoon and his stomach was telling him that he was about to have missed 10 whole meals. He pushed the blankets off of himself and left his room, heading towards the best place in the world, the galley. When he entered the galley, he ran to the kitchen to get his meals, knowing Thatch would know he was waking up and have them ready for him. Thatchy. I'm so hungry, can I? He stopped himself, remembering everything that had happened and why Thatch wasn't in the kitchen and the meals were not ready. Luffy. Ace said he was helping with dinner preparations since they needed the extra hands. Ace, I'm hungry, Luffy said, looking away from his brother. A chef frowned at the boy before pulling a few cookies from a jar and passed them to Luffy. I know they're not much, but we'll have dinner ready real soon, so try and wait until then, okay? The chef said, patting Luffy on the head, who just smiled even though it was a bit forced. Am I going to go check on Thatch, he said, putting a cookie in his mouth and running out of the room, leaving those there feeling sad for the boy. Luffy tried to enter the infirmary but was shooed out by the nurses, saying Thatch was sleeping and needed all the rest he could get. Luffy put up a huge fuss and even stomped his foot at them, refusing their refusal to let him see his brother. I was there, you know. I want to see him. He shouted at one of the nurses who was a bit more stubborn than the others. Thatch won't heal if you rush him like this, Luffy. He needs his rest and so do you. She said, crossing her arms. But I want to make sure Thatchy is really okay. He said, giving the nurse his big watery eyes, knowing that even Pops let him get away with anything because of them. Monkey D. Luffy, I've been looking after you since you were a baby, don't you dare use those eyes on me. She said, now putting her hands on her hips and staring down at the kid. I'm not like the men on this ship, I won't fold to those eyes, brat. She said, giving Luffy a smile as he huffed in annoyance. Luffy, Dr. Myra said, coming out of the infirmary. Doctor? I want to see Thatch. He said, but more demanded to her. The nurse is right, little one, Thatch needs his full rest. She said, kneeling down to the boy. She was normally a bit stricter with him since everyone else doted on him. She wanted him to grow stronger, but not expect the world to bow to him, that wasn't how things worked in life. But I'm worried, he said, knowing that if the doctor said no, it was a major no. I promise you that when he wakes up you will be the first to hear. If I can't tell you first, I shall get Marco to tell you, okay? She asked him and he sighed, still not liking not seeing him. Promise? He asked her, looking into her eyes and pulling his pinky out to her. I swear it, little brother. She said, linking her pinky with his, sealing their promise. Okay, I'm counting on you. He said before turning on his heels and leaving. Luffy knew that Pops was probably resting and Marco would be talking with the other commanders on their next actions. He wandered the ship and felt sadder and sadder with each step. He was so used to hearing Thatch's laugh from everywhere that it felt empty without it. Going to his special spot on the figurehead, Luffy sat down and really tried to relax. He listened to the waves and the gulls that passed by. He closed his eyes and just felt the breeze from the ocean and the smell of salt in the air. He felt a tear slip down his cheek as the thought that Thatch could have died entered his mind. But the laughter he didn't hear right this moment could be gone forever hurt his heart and made more tears fall. Luffy Ace had climbed over the railing and sat down beside the kid who hadn't heard him coming. Sabo followed right behind him and sat on Luffy's other side. Ace. Sabo. He whispered out and looked at his two brothers. Hey. Sabo said, smiling softly at the kid, and Ace just stared at the water, leaning back on his hands, a serious look over his freckled face. Seeing them and thinking of Thatch made him think scary things like, what if Teach wanted to kill them too? Why didn't he try and kill him that night? Ace, Sabo. He said, looking at the water but catching their attention. I want to become stronger. He said, tears falling once again as he saw in his mind Thatch fall to the ground. I want to become stronger and stronger, stronger and stronger, stronger and stronger, and even more stronger than that. That way I can protect everything and never lose anyone. The boys didn't say anything as they just listened and watched the sea, letting Luffy talk. Please, Ace. Sabo, he started, pulling his hat tighter on his head. Promise me you both won't die. He said, and a tick appeared on their heads as they stood up and smacked the kid on his head. Looking up at his now annoyed brothers, Ace pointed his finger at Luffy. You idiot, worry about yourself. We're both much stronger than you. Ace said to the kid, and Sabo just sighed since his annoyance was now gone as Ace used most of it up in that sentence. Listen, Luffy, and remember this. I will never die. He shouted at the kid who just cried after that. Sabo nodded his head in agreement with Ace, though they'd make sure each other lived forever if they could. I promise we won't die. Sabo started gently, but Ace stepped in, looking out towards the sea. There's no way I'd just die and leave behind my weakling of a little brother like you. Sabo gave Ace a look for being a jerk, but it seemed to be cheering Luffy up some. Luffy, we have to live life without any regrets. I like it here, but you plan on going out to sea on your own someday. He said, looking at the kid now. We'll need to get stronger together. Sabo sighed, Ace grinned, and Luffy finally, even just a little bit, laughed. Man, we need to get much stronger. He said, hugging his knees. The brothers sat beside each other, a new vow made between them that would last forever. Whitebeard listened to the boys talk by the figurehead and sighed deeply. He had just finished talking with the nurses and the doctor about Thatch's condition and was now checking on his children. The thought that one of his own could attack another deeply bothered him. At night, when his little Luffy came to him crying, screaming and covered in blood, would forever be in his mind of the disaster that happened. I want to become stronger and stronger, stronger and stronger, stronger and stronger, and even more stronger than that. That way I can protect everything and never lose anyone. Please, Ace. Sabo, promise me you both won't die. Hearing those words from his youngest really put in perspective just how affected his son had been from the situation. Luffy had not only seen the stabbing, but watched as his brother fell. He had seen someone he had been raised to trust attack his older brother. Anger bubbled in the older man's chest at the man who did this. How dare someone he put under his own protection and treated like his own son attack another of his family? Listen, Luffy, and remember this. I will never die. He heard Ace say and felt his anger diminishing slowly. Everyone dies, it's the natural order of the world. We are born weak and chose to grow stronger, then we become weak once again, then we die. That is how the world works, that's how it has always worked, and the old man accepted that. He knew that he was known as the god of the sea, as the strongest man in the world, but even he knew he wouldn't be able to stand at the top forever. Someday he would die and leave his beloved children behind him. It was always a sad thought to think of, but when he looked at the three sitting before him with smiles on their faces, he couldn't help but believe that the future generation might have some chance of becoming stronger than his own. After all, it wasn't every day the child of the previous pirate king became brothers with the future one. Both children rejected by the world at birth would become closer than any would ever allow. The old man couldn't stop the small chuckle at the thought of the trouble those children would someday get themselves into, and damn, he hoped they got into a lot of it. Line break. It had been 3 days since the attack and the doctor was in need of more medical supplies to help speed Thatch's recovery. His rib was broken from his mission. I was going to be working with him to repair it before the incident, but was left little to no time to do so. The broken rib has fractured more and is very close to piercing his lung. We have taken this opportunity to do the surgery needed to fix the broken rib and work on the stabbing wound at the exact same time. Unfortunately, we are in need of more medical supplies to keep both the surgeries clean and cared for properly. The Dr. Myra reported to the old man, knowing that if everyone wanted Thatch to live, she would need her demands to be met. One of our islands is close by, we can make a quick stop to restock. Our kitchen supplies could need a look over while we're in the area, Yoi. Marco said, taking notes on what was said and what would be needed. An island adventure may be just what the boys need right now, Vista said from his spot by the wall, thinking of the past few days and how they had been growing more and more agitated with one another. They have been unusually at each other's throat. Aizu agreed. He had been thinking that they were starting to show their emotions on Thatch's injury. When the incident happened, the two boys were focused on cheering Luffy up, then they were focused on what was happening all around them. Now that things had started to calm down, the two had begun to show moodiness towards one another and towards Luffy. Then that settles it. When will we reach the island? Pop said, smiling. Shortly, we can see it from the crow's nest. Vista replied with a smile. The other commanders in the room were also feeling excited to land on an island. After everything that had happened, they needed to drink themselves silly to forget the whole mess for a day. Marco left the meeting to go find the brats to give them the information, hoping they would be in a better mood than they had been all day. He saw them sitting on the railing just watching the island get closer and closer. A smile was on Luffy's face, and Sabo met in excitement a small smile on his own face. Ace was grinning at the smell of adventure as the island grew closer. We'll be stopping there for a while, Yoi, he said, coming up behind them looking at the island himself. He, like everyone else, was worried about the brats and their mood swings. He knew that they were children and were probably taking their emotions and feelings out in the best way they knew how. Sadly, it was the worst way for them to do this, by fighting with one another instead of helping each other. I bet I can beat up any wild animal that comes my way. Ace said, smirking. I could probably double the amount you take down. Sabo said, giving Ace a small glare. I won't even need any of your help at all. Luffy said, crossing his arms and glaring at the brothers, while Marco sighed. This was going to be a long day. When they reached the island, the boys didn't even wait, they just ran past everyone and headed straight into the forest. I hope they'll be alright, Haruta said, standing beside Marco, who was feeling weird about all of this. I hope so as well, Yoi. He sighed and watched the doctor and the head nurse walk off the ship towards town to stock up. I hope Thatch wakes up soon so they can go back to normal, Yoi. He said, turning away from the island to go sit by his brother. Me too, she agreed, following behind Marco as they headed to the infirmary. Things couldn't get much worse after all, and really having Thatch wake up would brighten everyone's day. Line break. The boys had been running through the forest chasing every wild animal that came their way. Unfortunately for Luffy, he wasn't as fast as his brothers and didn't catch anything. Ace and Sabo were good at catching birds and small animals such as rabbits, but nothing big enough to make them prideful. Being here with you guys is making the animals stay away from us. I'm going off on my own. Sabo declared before running into the forest. Ace agreed but knew that Luffy couldn't be left alone even if he wasn't happy about being stuck with the kid. Ace climbed a tree and rested his hands behind his head, closing his eyes, knowing that Luffy wouldn't go anywhere as long as he was there, so he had some time to just relax for a moment. In the time it took for Ace to close his eyes and relax, Luffy was already getting himself into trouble. Ace. You gotta help me, it's a bear. Luffy exclaimed, pushing his pipe out in front of him protectively. Ace opened his eyes and smirked at the kid but watched the scene from where he was. Huh? I thought you wanted to get stronger on your own. Ace said and smiled at the kid, but the bear growled loudly, but Luffy stood firm even if he wanted to run away. Damn it. He said, putting his pipe into an offensive position that Vista had taught him. He charged the bear and hit him in different areas, but the bear was a lot stronger than himself. Luffy jumped and dodged a blow only to jump again and see the claws coming his way. He didn't even have time to blink before the bear hit him hard. Luffy's hat flew off his head and blood sprayed the area before Luffy fell to the forest floor, motionless, blood pooling around him. Shock came over Ace momentarily before he screamed as loud as he could. Luffy. Sabo had heard Ace scream and ran back to the camp area they were at before to see a large bear leaving the scene. He pushed through the bushes and found Luffy on the ground, his shirt torn and bloody, and Ace shaking wildly, his eyes wide and panicked. "What happened?" Sabo asked, fear lacing his voice. "The bear. I wasn't I." He stammered, tears filling his vision. "Ace?" Sabo said, grabbing the boy's shoulders, holding him still. "Gee, go get Marco." He shouted at Sabo, and that was all it took for the blonde to get up and run back to the large ship. Ace carefully lifted Luffy onto his back before he started to run in the same direction. "Don't die. Luffy," Ace said with a shaking voice, but Luffy was unconscious, the pain too much for him to bear. "Line break." "Oh, my back hurts," Thatch said, opening his eyes and seeing a happy Marco, who had started to call a nurse over the moment he saw his friend waking up. "I bet it would, Yoi," he said, not hiding his excitement from his voice. "Where's Luffy?" Thatch asked, remembering that the kid was with him that night, and panic started to bubble up. What has Teach hurt him too? "He's safe and fine, he woke everyone up that night. He's with his brothers right now exploring an island, Yoi." Thatch sighed in relief knowing that the kid was okay. "He saved your life, Thatch," a nurse said, checking his bandages. "I'll have to make him the best dinner ever then, won't I?" He chuckled and then looked up towards the ceiling. There was a lot of banging going on up there. "What's happening?" he asked, really hating that he was injured and couldn't leave to find out himself. "I don't know, it was quiet all morning. Maybe the brats are back, Yoi," he said, hopefully liking the idea of bringing them to see Thatch. "Well, don't just stand there, bird brain, go check for me. The suspense might just kill me, you know," he said as Marco stood up. "Don't joke like that, Yoi," he said and waved to his brother, knowing he would be right back. Line break. Sabo ran as fast as he could, leaving the forest and out onto the pathway leading down to the ship. "Help!" he screamed, causing everyone to stop whatever they were doing. "What's wrong?" Aizu asked, kneeling down and grabbing the kid by the shoulders as Sabo took deep breaths. He was sweating heavily from running so fast. "Luffy," he started and took another deep breath. "Bear tried to fight, it didn't win, lots of blood," he panted, and Aizu stood up, pale-faced and wide-eyed, turning to his father. "Our brother needs help now. Luffy's been injured," he shouted, and everyone started to move. "Where are they?" Pops asked the kid, who was shaking from the adrenaline. "In the forest, Ace is carrying Luffy now," he said and pointed away as Aizu jumped from the ship to the land and ran towards where his brother was injured. A few from his division joined him while others began to move towards the infirmary, letting the nurses know to get the doctor back as soon as possible. "What's happening, Yoi?" Marco asked, coming up from visiting Thatch and seeing the commotion happening. "Marco?" Sabo said, moving to grab the man's hand, pulling him forward. "Where's your brothers? You're not still fighting, are you now, Yoi?" he said, sighing at the kids, but was excited to tell them Thatch was awake. "Luffy was attacked by a bear," he said, stopping all happy thoughts from entering Marco's mind. His face went blank as he took in the kid's words. "Then what the hell are we waiting for, Yoi?" he almost shouted. "Aizu is gone to find the kid, well, his division will be looking for the doctor," Pop said, placing a hand on Marco's shoulders but looking towards the island. "Why does nothing ever go right lately, Yoi?" he shouted, annoyed once again that something bad had happened to Luffy. "We can't choose when things go right or wrong, Marco, we can only deal with them as they come," Pop said, seriously looking down at his eldest son and one of his youngest. "I'm never letting him out of my sight again," Marco said, glaring at the island. He would find that bear and never again would it hurt another child, he would guarantee that. When Aizu found Ace and Luffy, he didn't hesitate, taking the kid off of his back and into his arms. He wanted to say something about the blood down Ace's back, but knew now was probably not a good time. The doctor had been found by the division members, and Ace was carried swiftly back to the ship in one of their arms. "Bring them down here, we don't have time if we want to save his life," Myra said, dropping her medical supplies she had got on the island. "What's going on?" Thatch asked from his bed, looking to see a lot of people crowding into the room. "Luffy was attacked by a bear," was all Aizu said, his red kimono now stained with Luffy's blood. "How bad?" Thatch whispered out, but judging by the frown on Aizu's face, it was bad. Luffy had been brought into the surgery room, and all anyone could do was wait until the doctor gave them an answer. Marco sat down beside Thatch and didn't say a word. He was so into his own head, he probably couldn't even speak if he wanted to. The doctor finally deemed Luffy worthy to rest and brought him back out and placed him into a bed. "Is he okay?" Thatch asked, looking at the kid, who seemed to be in pain. Myra shook her head, frowning, motioning for Marco to follow her and bring Ace. "I need to speak with Pops and everyone, the nurse will update you, Thatch." Thatch nodded his head and let them leave. Ace was still in shock. His body moved with Marco, but it was almost forced. Walking onto the main deck, she sat Ace down beside the old man and everyone surrounded her. The bear's claws went in deep. Luffy is lucky it didn't tear out his lungs. She started and everyone remained silent at her words. If the claw had gone any deeper, the boy would be dead. Ace bowed his head down and bit his lip. Unlike Thatch's injury where I knew I could save his life, I am unsure Luffy will survive this, she said, and Marco felt as if his world had come crashing down on him. How will we know if he will make it or not? Harita asked softly and the doctor looked away. We have stabilized him and closed the wound. If he survives the night he will have a slow recovery, but that will indicate he has the will to live on. She said. Marco felt like crying. He almost lost his best friend and now his little brother. It's my fault. Ace said, crossing his arms and covering his eyes. I knew it doesn't prove that you're strong by fighting on your own, he said, holding back tears. Ace, Aizu said, looking down at the kid. I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough at all. He said, blaming himself, thinking of how Luffy asked for help and he had refused him. I'm sorry, Luffy. Pops picked the kid up and let him cry. Ace hated crying, but the idea that Luffy could die hurt more than his pride this very moment. Luffy will live. Sabo shouted out at everyone, his blue eyes sharp and breaking through everyone's pain. We didn't give up when Thatch was injured. We had faith in our brother to live. We need to have faith that Luffy will live as well. Luffy is our brother. He is a Whitebeard pirate and pirate king in the making. He is stronger than we think he is. Have faith in him. Sabo shouted, tears falling down his own face. Luffy had accepted him and Ace even when they treated him like crap. Luffy had welcomed them when they didn't feel they fit in yet. Luffy was their treasure, and pirates protected their treasure no matter what. You're right, Yoi. Marco said, placing a hand on Sabo's shoulder. We need to have faith in our brother. Sabo smiled up at him through his tears. The doctor smiled at the boys and allowed them to spend the night in the infirmary watching over their little brother. They weren't allowed in the same bed, but they were close by. They helped him when he needed anything. They helped the doctor give him pain medication when asked. They did anything and everything. Thatch watched them work and smiled softly at them, realizing how much the boys had changed since they had first met. They're kinder now, Yoi. Marco said beside Thatch, watching them as well. He had told the nurses that he wasn't leaving, and that was final. They had tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't budge. He had enough of the troubles that had come their way. He wasn't letting the kid out of his sight for a very long time. Luffy has that effect on people. Thatch laughed but winced when his ribs hurt. At least you won't be bored when he wakes up, Yoi. Marco said humorlessly. He will wake up, after all he's one of us. Thatch said, smiling as the two kids fell asleep, their heads on their arms, sleeping by Luffy's bed. No matter his age, he will always be one of us, Yoi. Marco said and smiled at the kid. Sabo was right, he needed to have faith just as Luffy did. Line break. When morning came, Marco was slumped down in his chair and the boys were still sleeping on Luffy's bed. The light came in through one of the windows, brightening up the room. Luffy winced, the pain still there, but he opened his eyes. Ugh, he said, his throat dry and his stomach was a mixture between hungry and queasy. Sabo sat up, rubbing his eyes and looking into chocolate brown ones before a wide smile came to his face. Luffy? He almost shouted and hushed when he saw the kid wince. Ace opened his eyes at Sabo's loud voice to see the kid laying there, his eyes open and a small smile on his face. Mornin', he croaked out, and Ace brought the glass of water to the kid's mouth. Luffy tried to sit up but let out a cry when the pain got bad. Don't move, we'll help you. Ace said, really careful to give the boy water without spilling it. Luffy drank the water and smiled in a thank you sort of way as Marco began to wake up. Luffy's okay. Sabo said to the man whose eyes sparkled at seeing Luffy awake. How do you feel, Yoi? He said, walking over to his bedside. Hurt. Thatch smiled at the scene. Morning, kid, thanks for joining me here. Thatch said, and Luffy turned his head fast, as well as the other two brats. Thatch. Even though Thatch had watched them last night, they were so preoccupied with Luffy, they didn't even realize he was awake. Glad to see you finally noticed me. He said, sarcastically, laughing as they attempted to hug him, but was caught by a nurse. If you jump him, his injury will get worse, boys. Thatch shook his head and laughed. I'm not that hurt. He said, but the doctor came out, hand on her hip, and glared at him. Your injury could have killed you. You're hurt, and until I say you're not going anywhere. She said and looked over at Luffy. I'm glad you're alright, kid, but you and Thatch will be spending time with me. She said, and Luffy just nodded. Still tired. Was all he said before closing his eyes again, but smiled widely. Glad you're alive, Thatchy. He said before falling back to sleep. Same to you, brat. Thatch said, smiling as a nurse began to change his bandages. Why is he still sleepy, Yoi? Marco asked, worry all over his posture. The pain medication will do that, he needs as much rest as possible to have a full recovery. You were right, brat, we should always have faith in our siblings and each other. Sabo smiled at her. Luffy won't die, he's too stubborn for something like that. He laughed out and Ace joined him this time. From here on out he would protect Luffy from anything and everything. Never again would he ask for help and be turned away. Luffy was his little brother, his best friend, his treasure. When I get out of these bandages I'm going to make the best dinner ever for you brats. Thatch said happily to have his family around him. I'll help. Ace agreed and fist bumped the man smiling. It took a week before Luffy and Thatch were released from the infirmary both on bed rest orders, but free all the same. I'm coming with you kid Yoi. Marco said carrying Luffy away from the huge party to celebrate both his and Thatch's recovery. Coming with me where? He asked confused. Were they going somewhere? When you leave to become the Pirate King I'm coming too Yoi. The look of horror that crossed Luffy's face caused Marco's brow to twitch in annoyance. You'll embarrass me. How can I become the Pirate King with you hovering over me? He shouted and punched Marco's chest. Too bad you're not leaving my side until you're older than Pops Yoi. He said and Luffy glared at him. That's not fair. You're being a meanie. Ace. Marco's being a meanie. Ace appeared from out of nowhere and glared up at Marco. What did you say to Luffy? He said crossing his arms, a dark shadow over his face and eyes. Marco sighed, prepared to fight for himself. His brats were growing up and the old man was right. He couldn't decide when the bad stuff happened, but he knew that he wasn't alone to deal with it when it did. All he needed to do now was make sure the good things outweighed the bad and all would be right in his world. After all, he has the greatest family around a man could ask for. Marco. Luffy shouted from across the ship, making said man turn his head towards the preteen who was running his way, a large grin on his face and his straw hat sitting proudly on his head. What did you do this time Yoi? Marco sighed but couldn't help but smile back at the kid. I know what you're talking about, it's not like I pulled the best prank ever on Thatch or anything, he said, turning his face away from Marco and sweating heavily. We need to move now. Thatch will be here soon. Ace said, coming up behind Luffy grinning like a cat. Why aren't you wearing a shirt Yoi? Marco sighed for what felt like the millionth time. Marco had been arguing with Ace about his new hate for shirts of any kind for a while now. I like them and the ladies like a man with no shirt. He said, his grin getting wider. Why's that? Luffy asked, tilting his head, and Marco glared at Ace. Because never mind Luffy, we need to move now. Ace said, avoiding Marco's look. Maybe I should stop wearing shirts. Luffy said to himself, which caused Ace to laugh loudly. And show off your lack of a chest little brother. He scoffed, knowing that Luffy hated that Ace looked more muscular than him. I'll get stronger. I'm only 12 you know. Luffy shouted, pouting his cheeks out, looking up at Ace who only pinched one of his cheeks. Right, and once you're 15 like me I'll be 18 and still stronger than you. He challenged but smiled fondly as Luffy flared up about becoming stronger than him anyways. Boy. Are you guys stupid? We just pranked the pranking king, he's not going to let us get away with this so easily. We really need to move like now. Sabo said, jumping down and shaking his head at his brother's actions. That's right, you boys must be stupid. A soft voice had formed behind the trio, making a shiver go up their spine. Now, who gave you boys permission to pull a prank on me? Thatch said, glaring down at the now shaking teenagers who took a step back towards Marco, who only crossed his arms and shook his head. A dark shadow came across Thatch's face, making him look slightly sadistic as he crossed his own arms and walked towards them carefully. You do know that action is punishable by a saltwater bath at the kindest. He said slowly to the boys. It was Luffy's fault. Ace said, pushing Luffy forward only to have the kid step back quickly and push Ace forward. It was Ace's plan. He said in his defense. But you went along with it. Ace said back with some heat. Next time you want to prank someone, make sure you have the strength to back yourselves up afterwards. Thatch said, bringing his fist down on both of the dark-haired teenagers' heads. Swoey Thoch, they said from the floor as the man shook his head. Don't back away just yet Blondie, I'm not done with you either, he said, turning his eyes towards a now pale Sabo. Why, you heard them, it was Ace's idea, he said, putting his gloved hands up in front of him protectively. Yes, I did hear that. I also know that neither Ace nor Luffy have the brain capability to think through the smaller details. He said, taking a step towards the kid whose eyes widened. They need help with the major planning, so I think we need to have a small chat now, little brother. He said, smirking before bringing his own fist down onto the blonde's head, making him cry out in pain. Sorry, we won't do it again, he said, holding the forming bump. Oh, I hope you do it again, next time just make sure not to get caught. Thatch said, smirking while Marco laughed quietly. They've grown up Yoi. Marco said, looking at the three as they pulled themselves off of the floor. Yeah, but they're still brats to me. Thatch said, smiling. It was the first time they had attempted to prank him in return, so he was actually quite proud of their bravery. Think they'll try again Yoi? Marco asked, watching Ace catching the gleam in his brown eyes. I guarantee it. Thatch also saw the look in Ace's eyes, but was looking towards Luffy, who was grinning like the sun. It had been 3 years since the betrayal of Teach and the bear attack that had left both Thatch and Luffy in a whole lot of trouble. Marco had done well with his promise to never let Luffy out of his sight, much to the boys' dismay. Marco was sure just to spite him that Luffy was now learning how to avoid him at all costs whenever a new adventure called him. Marco had mentioned to the kid once that he planned to go with him on his journey, but with a snarky Ace jumping down his throat and a tearful cry to the old man, that idea was halted very quickly. "They're up to something else, I can feel it," Thatch said, grinning widely and waving goodbye to his friend as he went to join his apprentices of trouble. "Marco," Haruta said, looking quite serious while walking towards him. "Whatever they did to your division, I'm so sorry, Yoi," he said, hoping they didn't do anything to sever this time. She shook her head and motioned him to follow her, which caused his brow to rise further up his face. "Dragon has been spotted around this area," she said, and Marco frowned. They walked towards Pops, where she mentioned that news to him as well. "What should we do if he wants to see Luffy?" she asked quietly, not wanting anyone to hear her. "Then we will deal with that as it comes," Pop said, but frowned as well under his large mustache. "Luffy belongs with us, I won't let him hurt the kid, Yoi," Marco said, crossing his arms and scowling. Luffy was his little brother, Pops was their father. Dragon had not once made any contact with the kid, so in his eyes had no right to him. "Marco, I doubt Dragon would want to hurt his son. I believe he doesn't know how close he is at this moment to him," Pop said, knowing that the winds can lead you anywhere on these seas. Dragon was probably busy with whatever he is doing to think of his growing son. "I hope you're right, Yoi." But it didn't matter to him if Pops was, Marco would protect Luffy from anything. "Did you hear what they are calling Dragon now?" Haruta said, taking a seat in front of Pop's chair. Marco didn't pay much attention to rumors, he focused on facts and his family before him. Haruta's division was on intel and information, so she would be the one to keep up to date on everything, rumor or not. "They're calling him the most wanted man in the world," she said seriously, knowing the cost of that new title and the effects it would have on Luffy. Pops frowned, thinking of his youngest sons and the cost of their lineages onto them. Ace, being Roger's son, would be marked for death because of his father. If Dragon was now being called, as Haruta said, then it would mean Luffy was in the same position as Ace. "The world will want Luffy dead, they will see him as a child that should never have been born, Yoi," Marco whispered fearfully, his eyes widening. "We'll just have to protect him now, won't we?" Haruta said, standing up and brushing her pants off before smiling. "That's right, Yoi," Marco agreed, calming down a little and following her towards the galley. "He won't always have us by his side, he needs to get stronger now," Pop said to himself, sadly looking towards his family. Line break. Ace was frowning, which wasn't too uncommon really. Ace liked to smile, especially when Luffy was doing something silly and borderline stupid. He liked to smile when he got a recipe right and Thatch congratulated him. He liked to smile when the three helped pull off the prank against Thatch, even if they were caught in the end. He refused to smile when he found out that Luffy's father was no better than his own. Ace had been going to get supplies for their next prank when he overheard the conversation between Haruta, Marco and Pops. He knew that Luffy wasn't the son of anyone here on the crew. Thatch had told him that much when he first arrived on this ship. For Luffy to have the same hatred looked down on him from the world due to who his father is was something that Ace refused to let happen. He had known the effects done to him from the people that hated him for his father. To think that the anger he felt would be something Luffy might feel scared him. What if Roger had a kid? Hahaha, it would be really bad if he had one. He'd be a demon who wouldn't deserve to be born or to live. Ace had been so absorbed in his anger he hadn't heard Thatch come up beside him, leaning on the railing looking out at the sea. "When Luffy's father first contacted us, we thought he was crazy. We knew of Garp and the craziness the man had, so we figured his son was no better." Thatch started, startling Ace. "It turns out Garp's son was a lot more sane than we gave him credit for. Luffy has his grandfather's craziness, so it must have skipped a generation." Thatch laughed, and Ace couldn't help but smile softly at that. Haruta has been watching the man for a long time, just in case Luffy's name was ever mentioned anywhere. "We swore that if Luffy's name came up we'd deal with that right away, but it never did," he continued softly. "Marco has been even more careful than all of us, he knows the dangers that the world could be to Luffy, and that's why he was afraid of you both in the beginning." Ace looked at Thatch, now curious. "Marco was afraid of us?" He didn't think that was possible. "You boys were very different from us, you had seen the world in a different way and lived by that way. We had worked hard to always keep Luffy protected, to watch where he went, who he talked to, who might notice him. When you two came you started to show Luffy a different way of life, and as much as we knew it was good for him we couldn't help but worry. You boys went on island adventures without either Marco or myself and came home with cuts and bruises," he said to Ace, who was shocked at all of this information coming his way. "Then there was in the incident where Luffy was beaten by that man and you didn't tell us right away. That scared us a lot and made our protective natures go up more than they were. When Luffy started to push us away for you two, we didn't know how to react to that. We wanted to give you boys a chance, but you both were threatening everything we had done to protect him." Ace had looked away from Thatch by this point. "You've made him stronger both mentally and physically." Thatch complimented, looking at Ace now, even though the kid wasn't looking at him. "It will come a day when our little brat won't need our hands to hold or our eyes to watch over him. He'll want the sea and everything on it, and we won't be allowed to slow him down, and that's alright," Thatch said, turning around, placing his hands behind his head. "Unlike us, you and Sabo there can protect him in ways we cannot," he said, acknowledging the blonde kid for the first time. "I believe that Luffy isn't ready to know about his father," Thatch said, walking forwards away from them. "But someday he will be. When that time comes, I hope you're there to help him through that." And he walked away to his kitchen to start dinner preparations. "We just got a rare moment of Luffy's past," Sabo said with a small smile. They knew a lot about Luffy since they've been with him since he was 7, but to hear a bit more of his origins was refreshing. "Now we just need to protect him from it," Ace said, putting his hands together and leaning on the railing. "We will, after all he's our little brother," Sabo said, smiling at Ace, who returned it. "What you guys doing over here? I thought we were gonna prank Marco's division," Luffy said, running up to the teen, scowling at them. We just forgot," Ace said, turning around, quickly rubbing the back of his head sheepishly. "What's wrong with you guys?" he asked quietly, his brown eyes looking them over seriously. "Nothing, Lou, we love you, you know that, right?" Sabo said, walking up and pulling him into a hug. "You're the best little brother we could have," Ace said, pulling the now squirming Luffy into a hug as well. Luffy paled and did everything to get out of their arms. "Help. Someone's replaced Ace and Sabo with weird creatures that give sloppy hugs," Luffy shouted before running away with a wide grin on his face. "Why that little?" both teens said before chasing after him, prank forgotten. Ace and Sabo would protect Luffy from anything and everything, no matter the cost. Ace knew the darkness that followed him because of his father and refused to let Luffy walk through any of that alone. Ace was made of fire now, and he would use all of his flames to keep Luffy bright. That was his silent promise to his little brother now and forever. That is the end, so thanks for watching. Comment down below with recommendations on what fanfic I should do next. And remember to like and subscribe to my channel.